Build creative confidence. Beat the inspiration addiction. Join the Writer's Gym. Hello everybody, welcome back to the Writer's Gym. I'm Dr Rachel Knightley, PT, writing coach, fiction and non-fiction author, and I am here with the editor of one of the most beautiful horror Gothic things ever. Dr Xavier Aldana Reyes is reader in English literature and film at Manchester Metropolitan University and a founding member of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies. His publications include the monographs Contemporary Body Horror, Horror, Film and Affect, and Body Gothic, and the edited collections Twenty-First-Century Gothic and Edinburgh Companion, and Horror, A Literary History, British Library 2016. Xavier is co-president of the International Gothic Association and a founding member of the Horror Studies Specialist Interest Group, hosted by the British Association of Film, Television and Screen Studies. Xavi, I love reading that bio because I can see a career as a writer, as an academic, based on the things that you love, the things that you enjoy.
That's right. I've always been very uncompromisingly myself, I guess. As an academic, I guess you're normally encouraged to sort of ride waves of interest. And yeah, I've resolutely stuck to the things that make me passionate, that I feel the strongest love and deepest connection to. So yeah, it's a career dedicated to my love of horror.
When did that love of horror begin?
Well, that might surprise you, but not as early as, it does for most people. You normally hear writers say, I was writing horror stories from the age of 5, or, I was reading whatever, Edgar Allan Poe at the age of 7. I think for me, as for many people in my generation, it probably was Goosebumps that did it. That was the sort of gateway, because I was actually quite squeamish and found horror really difficult when I was younger, probably because I wasn't accustomed to it. So, and I remember having this distinct nightmare in which I'd be watching this horror film that I didn't want to watch. It was just a random thing. It was like a witch on the screen. And I remember the nightmare, I would close my eyes and I would still be able to see the screen through my eyelids. So I think that's how traumatized I was as a child with horror. It just absolutely horrified me. But then I read Goosebumps, and that's very tame kind of horror. No one dies in those books, or, the dog is safe. So, and then through Goosebumps, I ended up reading Stephen King, and then I encountered Clive Barker, Poppy Z-Bride, and, but it was only really when I started doing my master's it was actually in modern and contemporary literature that I encountered the term Gothic, and that I started sort of putting the threads together and realizing that a lot of the things I'd been reading as a teenager were sort of like coming together. I didn't necessarily read Lovecraft, whom I loved as a teenager, as a Gothic or a horror writer. He was just someone I was introduced to. But suddenly all those things sort of came together, and I was like, oh, maybe I do like horror. Angela Carter was another writer I discovered at university that changed my life. And again, she's someone who is normally encompassed by the Gothic label. It's been a process of discovery, but I can't tell you that, I began my life as a horror fan. It was a very gradual thing.
It's so lovely hearing this, because as you said, pretty much every single thing in that, I was leaping up going, me too, me too, me too, because as listeners already have heard dozens of times, I wrote a horror story in my early 30s out of a dare when my now partner said, maybe you don't dislike horror as much as you think you dislike horror, given that all of the novels that you loved at university were in fact Gothic novels. This memo had just not arrived in my brain at all. And it's so interesting how that perception shifts. Was it for you the term horror that was maybe, I don't want to say problematic, but was that the off-putting thing? I think for me, the misconception that horror meant arms falling off, blood spurting, rather than the ghost stories, the dark romances, the sense of unease, all of the things that I was fascinated by. I think it was a misunderstanding of the terminology, put me back from it for a while.
It's such an ample label, isn't it? Because we talk about Anne Rice as horror, in the same breath as we talk about Clive Barker as horror. And obviously, what we call horror is always a retrospective thing. Frankenstein has become one of those canon novels, but it was never really published or marketed as horror. The very term didn't quite exist. So I think there's always an element of sort of like retrospectively putting texts in labels that work for us. I think for me, it was really just a case of no one really in my family liked horror. I've always always been very close to my mother, and she was really more into thrillers. So I guess, that was kind of like my acculturation into horror, was sort of the thriller genre to begin with. I think for me it was more a case of I thought I couldn't take it. The perennial question, why would you put yourself through something negative, emotionally negative, for the sake of entertainment? And I think it was just when I started realizing that there was a lot more to it, although I have and still am fascinated by this notion of negative emotions and why we crave them. I certainly don't want to pathologize them. I think that they're very natural. But I think at the time I thought, I can't really hack it. I think what it was is I watched It, the television miniseries, way too early. And Pennywise the Clown just haunted my dreams for the best part of my teenage years. I kept or maybe early teenage years, I should say. But I have distinct memories of looking under the bed. Pennywise is not under the bed. I'm okay. That moment at the beginning of the film, and then in the shower, where he just comes out of the shower and like the teeth, that haunted my dreams. I think it was just experiences like that. I never had that with literature, though. So when I then went on to read It, the novel, it didn't affect me anywhere near as much. So I think it was just initially the violence of certain images. I'm a child of the 80s. I was a teenager in the 90s. So I was consuming a lot of those 1980s, 1970s, quite out there horror films, lots of special effects, lots of gruesome effects. That probably explains why I eventually ended up looking at body horror. But yeah, I think I watched a lot of that stuff way too early, and it just, it seared my mind in a way that I thought, or maybe I just can't take this stuff. As any kind of like hardened fan will tell you, though, you build up your tolerance, and then once you get past that stage, you start looking at exactly what you were saying before, the other things that you missed out when you were too busy being scared by the shark clown, if you like, the messages behind them. And of course, that's what eventually led to a career in academia, is just wanting to sort of like poke the veil a bit more.
That was actually going to be one of my next questions. Was I think these things can often be quite chicken and egg. But you said you were doing your MA when you started to realise that was the direction. How much was it, I am in academia, oh good, I get to talk about these, and how much of it was, I want to talk about these, I will make these decisions in academia? What was it like for you?
Again, very unplanned. None of it really. I mean, I was going to be a secondary teacher for a long while. After I did my MA, I was applying for a PGC in secondary education in London. It would have been a very different life, I guess. What I've always known is I love teaching. People tell me, I'm not going to say that of myself, people tell me I'm a good communicator. I don't know. What I can tell you is I love talking to people, and I love the interactions that you get in classroom. I love getting people enthused about things, and I love conversation. I genuinely do. I'm a bit of a recluse, so I'm not like super sociable, but I do like social contexts in which, we get to discuss things I'm interested in, like book clubs, for example, or that sort of thing. So I guess I gravitated towards that. And then it was during my MA, after doing this unit, I think it was called Foreign Bodies, Gothic Bodies, that I started thinking about the Gothic in more depth, and that I started sort of reading academics like Catherine Spooner, who ended up becoming my supervisor. And I thought, oh, right. So there is such a thing as Gothic academia, and people have actually. I discovered that there was a long history of looking at horror from a critical perspective. So I started digging a bit deeper, but never really with any kind of sense that I would make it in that world, because it just looked so, I don't know, daunting, especially as an MA student. So I didn't plan it. The reason I went on to do a PhD was because I thought I always have time to go back to a PGCE if this whole PhD scenario doesn't quite come to fruition. As it happens, chance is always a big factor in these things. Catherine Spooner happened to be giving a talk at Strawberry Hill, which, as Gothic fans know.
But in case anybody hasn't been to Strawberry Hill, let's just talk about how that is a reality based on a fiction. Do you want to just talk a bit about Strawberry Hill?
Yes, it's sort of like the influence or the inspiration behind The Castle of Otranto for Horace Walpole, normally considered the first Gothic writer, or his novel, The Castle of Otranto, normally considered the first Gothic novel in the canon. I'm not sure to what extent I actually even knew this when I gave a talk there. I probably did know this at the time, but I don't think I was aware of my first ever academic talk is in Strawberry Hill. I don't think I gave it much significance at the time. But yes, so Catherine was there, and I really got on well with her, and I told her how much I had loved her book, Contemporary Gothic. And she was like, well, why don't you come up to Lancaster and study a PhD. And honestly, it's one of those things that you do when you're young. From the vantage point of, I'm 42 this year. If I had to do it all again, I'm not sure that I would, because so much of that is that chutzpah of like, okay, well, there's nothing keeping me here, so let's do it. So I uprooted myself from London, where I had spent 4 years finishing my BA and doing my MA. And then somehow, even though I was very poor, somehow found the money working 2 or 3 jobs to pay for the first year of my PhD, not really without a clear sense of how I would get to the end of it. And then I got very lucky. I got a scholarship on the second year that paid for the last 2 years of my PhD. And, and then I was very lucky again, and I got a job pretty much before I finished the PhD, which is quite a rare thing these days. So yeah, if I had to repeat all of those things, I'm not sure I even could, even if I was to plan it really thoroughly, because I think so much of it was happenstance. But I feel very strongly that I am in the right place. And although I would never do it all again, I am very happy that I am where I am today.
Yeah. And that's something that is really important, I think, for a lot of my clients and my listeners who are at some level doing a jigsaw career, as a writer and as all of the other things that probably interest you as a writer, working out how that unique jigsaw is created in the first place, much like Horace Walpole inventing the house as well as the genre for the novel, and putting it all together in a way that reflects who you are, what you're interested in, what you need. It's probably a blessing in a way that we don't completely know, because the whole way that we do it is by not knowing, isn't it? You work out what you're interested in and you follow that thread.
You do, yeah. You kind of like, you go where life takes you. It's a little bit like, jobs. You go wherever the job is, I guess. So I kind of like, I followed the trail of Gothic breadcrumbs, I guess. I never even planned on staying in the UK, really. I only did so because I went on an exchange program to Roehampton University for a year, and then
where I was lecturing.
Oh, lovely.
And where I did my BA.
I have very fond memories of that department and that campus. I had a lovely time there. So yeah, I never thought it was going to go beyond 12 months. I fell in love at the time. So that's what kind of like kept me there for a bit longer, doing the MA. And then, as I say, I never really planned on doing a PhD until it suddenly happened. Sometimes when I go back to London, this is a very Gothic image. I've got this kind of weird feeling between like nostalgia and, a bit like The Man from the Crowd, the Edgar Allan Poe short story. I'm kind of like half expecting to see an alternative version of myself, this double of me who stayed in London and became a secondary teacher.
Are you going to write it?
No. It's too close to the bone.
Is that a challenge for everybody out there? Are we allowed to borrow it? Are we allowed to have a second year living in London somewhere?
Yes, it'd be my guest. But yeah, there's that moment. I think it's also in Henry James's The Jolly Corner, that kind of like almost encounter with the you that could have been, or the other you that could have been. I find London a very haunting place for that reason.
It's so interesting you mentioned Roehampton with that, because I did my BA there. I went to Bath for my MA, and then I was in Hull. I was still living in London, but I was there. But then I was lecturing at Roehampton. I absolutely have experienced that sensation of the different versions of yourself that you can sort of see in your head walking down the same path that you are now on. And I remember thinking that around, the lake at Roehampton at Frobel College, and just walking around there. It feels to me like it hasn't changed. And I do have that sensation of all the different selves and all of the sort of offshoots that could happen with that. But it was so interesting when I first approached you to say, would you come and talk to us here? And I hear from particularly non-fiction writers something along the lines of, does it count if it's not fiction? And I find that so interesting, because the fundamental skills, the fundamental emotional ingredients of writing are that jigsaw putting together. I talk about it as an artist's palette, that it's our imagination, our interests, our questions about the world, our memories. We're doing that same thing of mixing those colours in a way that is always going to be unique. And it is interesting how maybe we don't always perceive that in ourselves, that we are still mixing those colours, doing the same thing.
That's why I was so keen to come and talk to you, because first of all, I never really get the opportunity to talk about writing as a thing. And normally whenever I do podcasts or interviews, it's about a specific topic I've been researching. And as you say, I mean, to me, academic writing is creative writing, and it always has been, but it's not really generally the perception, right? Academic writing is perceived to be objective, more kind of like in the realm of the scientific, or, the kind of reason driven. And we tend to think about creative writing as a lot more passionate, driven by emotion and so on. But you're absolutely right. I think it's impossible to write something completely objectively. And you pour yourself into every project that you do one way or another, which is also why projects feel dated, don't they? When you look at them 15 years on, because none of us stays the same. Maybe at some fundamental core level we do, but I look at things that I wrote 15 years ago and I don't recognize myself really because I've changed. So I think, that tells me that academic writing is never just purely objective. It's just as much driven by the person writing it. And I think that also comes down to the level of the writing. I mean, some of the people I love reading most, people like Kim Newman, who I deeply admire, or Roger Luckhurst, who I also really admire, Anna Bogutskaya, Alexandra Helenicolas, they just have that really personal touch to the way they write. You're not just reading any of those people for the content, you're reading it for the way they deliver that content. So yeah, I think that's what you strive for, I guess, as a writer and as an academic, to sort of like somehow give some of yourself in the project that you write. I should say as well that one of the reasons I write so much is I am a frustrated creative writer. In another life, one of those other selves, that I might encounter on a walk in London would be this like very frustrated creative writer who is still trying to write that novel that will never get published, or if it gets published, it will never do very well. Maybe I'm sublimating some of that through my academic writing.
In coaching sessions, I'm always very careful to ask what level of challenge somebody is up for that day. As an interviewer, I don't have to do that. So I'm just going to say, if those breadcrumbs come along now, if an idea for a story like the one that we just talked about, if those come up now, is there a danger of saying internally, I am this kind of writer, not that kind of writer, and therefore that's not going to happen because that's one of the other lives?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I started writing a novel about 2 or 3 years ago, straight after COVID, which I found really traumatizing, but not for, I found it very paralyzing as a writer. It really stopped me in my tracks. And then suddenly when we came out of COVID, I had this sudden burst of creativity, and I started writing this novel that will probably never get finished, and I had a fully formed structure for it. What stops me really is the research. I find in the same way that we don't think about creative writing as academic, I don't think we think of creative writing as academic itself. And I know from interviewing loads of writers, Rosie Garland, who we work with locally quite a lot, how much historical research goes into writing, for example. That's always what stops me. It's just like I would now have to take 6 months off to research the life of nuns in convents in the 1960s in whatever part of Spain in order to be able to write the rest of this novel. So yeah, that has to be parked. Maybe not for another life, maybe for retirement. I think my biggest frustration is just the days aren't long enough, and the months aren't long enough, and the years aren't long enough. I'll never get to write even half of the things I would like to write.
The supportive shouting at the radio that I can hear out there, I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of people come to me and say, I can't write my novel because I have to do the research first. And the thing that I would be saying back at that point is, what if, just what if, the idea that has already arrived gets transcribed, simply transcribed, just this is what I can hear, onto the piece of paper, leaving the great big gaping holes into which please insert research, but being honest about what are the images, what are the dialogue moments, what do I see, what do I hear. I'm going to be honest with my piece of paper, and then I will do the research later, but that happens there. Now, the reason that I like that is that people from scientific or academic backgrounds for whom doing that might feel unprofessional realise that they can have the fun. And this, for me, is the important thing, is getting back into a spirit of this is not an exam room, this is a playroom. And you mentioned Kim Newman, who's also, as well as Rosie, been on this podcast, you probably know. And I know Kim reasonably well enough to ask lots of questions about, well, life, the universe. What I really admire about Kim, and I'm just looking at the bookshelf, reminding myself about the different ones at the moment, but some of my favourites include The English Ghost Story. And I look at things like that, and I look at the way that he reviews without giving stars on his website, that he will say, in his voice, with his clarity, with his values, this is what I see. And that it's not, oh, it's crap, or yeah, it's brilliant. It's just the truth as clearly as it can come. I enjoy that quality existing in the world. You know, it's knowing what we feel is important, getting out of our own way. And I suppose what makes me sad is the idea that you won't give yourself that fun. Because I love your writing and I love the way that your passion comes through it when I listen to you talking about these things, or when I read you talking about these things. I see the clarity and I see you loving the subject. It's never the messenger, it's the message, which is how I find Kim and Rosie and lots of other people is it's coming through us. So is this just me putting a little thought in of, oh, go on. You might enjoy it. You might enjoy writing the novel.
Thank you so much. I mean, I do. I love writing. I mean, I did get 15 or 20,000 words of that novel sort of started, just as you said, for the pure fun of it. As an academic writer, you never write for the money anyway. So I guess I'm used to writing for the sake of writing. It's definitely something I couldn't live without. I don't think I could do this job if it didn't involve some degree of writing. To me, it's not the only thing that I enjoy about the job. I enjoy all of the aspects of the job, but it's the one that, as you say, allows me the most creative fun to have. It's definitely different skills. And I think writing creatively is in some ways harder than writing academic writing, purely for the fact that when you're writing academically, I love structure. I love structure on things. I know there are writers like Ramsey Campbell who start somewhere and the novel just materializes as they write it, almost as if it was like floating in the ether. I need more structure. I can't let things go on a tangent, especially with my academic writing. So I'm very structured. I always have very kind of clear sense of where things are going. With creative writing, it's harder because it's true that kind of a stereotype of the characters have their own voice and they take you places you don't want to go or you didn't think you would go. It's kind of one of the reasons maybe that I'm a little bit scared of taking that leap. It just feels like the character wants to go in this direction, but I don't know it very well, and that's kind of the fear as well of like, and I probably should start doing that research. You're right. Probably the research becomes a bit of an excuse. I think I will get to write some of this stuff, but academic life is just so busy. It's so much easier to just park it on the side and think like, I'll return to it when the ref is done or whenever the next project is delivered. But I'd like to think, as I said before, that I sublimate some of it through my own writing. And I'm in the incredibly privileged position now that I get to write for other outlets as well, things like boutique DVD collections, video essays. I've even written a few things for journals. I mean, nothing at the level of film reviews like the ones that Kim does. And it does exercise a different part of your brain. You have to find, I think it's just the remit that you use, the register that you use is different. You're reaching a different audience. And I quite like that about writing, about the fact that your writing morphs a little bit depending on who you think is listening to you. So I do think I have at least one novel in me, but it might not get written until I retire.
Well, you know where we are at the Writers' Gym if you decide that you want to start earlier than that, or indeed then. I'm a big fan of noticing that enough time and enough confidence are things we are tempted to wait for because they don't exist. There will never be a time when I don't look up to a bunch of people that we have just talked about. There would have been a time when I wouldn't have had the courage to email you, but then after years of going, oh my God, look, writers are just people. We're all people. I'm just a person. They're a person. Who knew? That continues when we look at, anybody who has been on this podcast, it's a bit like having a little I Spy guide in the back of my head. We've all got something we think we're slightly not entitled to do. And it is the human condition. And therefore it's not about changing it. It is not about altering the human condition. It is about noticing the human condition and not letting it stop you have the fun, I think.
It's an incredibly brave thing to do. And this is why I hugely admire any creative who manages to get anything published, at whichever level, independently with a big publisher. I think it takes a lot of bravery and a lot of confidence even to sort of get your word out there in that way. Maybe at some point I will build up the courage to do it myself. I think you're right. I think part of it is a lack of confidence.
Well, you know where I am if you ever want to challenge any of that. You mentioned just now it being sort of easier in terms of academic publishing, in terms of writing the next thing. I'm going to ask a very, very broad, how does that work for you? Because I think for a lot of people listening, they've not experienced that kind of thing. So in terms of your books, your articles, working with the film companies, things like that, what is that like? What happens for you?
I think what's different about academic writing is that you've got a goal in mind. And again, that depends on the kind of publication that you're working on. So if I'm working on an article, there is an expectation for that article to be accepted for a journal that is going to make some kind of contribution to knowledge in that area. So I know I have to line things up in a specific way to head there. So there'll be some expectation of dealing with the debate in that area up to the point that you make that contribution. And I'm very good at synthesis. I tend towards surveys because I think I'm very good at observing things and observing patterns. This sounds incredibly arrogant.
I wish I had a swear box. I want a swear box. I do this for when everybody says I'm not a real writer, so-and-so's a real writer, we have an imaginary swear box for this, but I'm going to make another imaginary swear box for this. Sounds arrogant. What you do is really, really interesting. You are being generous in sharing it. It is not arrogant.
So yeah, there's always an element of I think I'm good at synthesis, which I think has served me right, especially in terms of writing overviews of things, or how is this film doing this, or how is this novel, how has it been seen over the years. I'm very good at sort of being able, I'm a good reader, and I think I can extract the core of a reading quite easily. So I think that helps me in synthesizing information. So I think there's a lot more of that going on in academic writing. It's always your own take on whatever you read anyway, in the same way that there are 100 ways of reading Frankenstein, there are 100 ways of reading Barbara Creed. But I think depending on where you place your emphasis and the angle. So I think that's slightly different. I think when you're writing creatively, you're trying to sort of somehow bring this vision that you have. I think of it a bit like painting. You've got the idea in your mind, but the process of getting it onto the canvas, that process of mediating from your brain or your, the image in your head to the page is the challenge. It's a little bit like that with academic writing, but there's less room for all of the kind of, shall we say, all of the ambiguous elements to come in, because when you're writing creatively, there's tone, there's focalization, there's character, where does this scene go? I mean, I've talked about this with Rosie Garland in the past, how she likes, for example, to have the various bits of the novel on the floor, and then she decides where, which it's not quite so hard with academic writing because you've got to follow the structure of the argument. You can't, well, I guess you could start at the end, but you probably do start at the beginning and take the reader with you. It's a bit more like, I guess, doing a tour of a museum. You will guide the person through your view of that particular area, and then maybe end up then making some kind of overall statement about the state of things. I particularly love writing academic books because I think it's the expansive element of the book that speaks to me. I find that however much structure I want to put on things, you never really end up writing exactly what you had in mind. So there is an element of that, a creative risk to academic writing as well, that the book kind of goes places you didn't think it would. But I like the fact that when I'm writing in that kind of more longer term, ideas change, and you change with them as well, the more you write about them. So you find out what you wanted to say in the process of writing it. I think that's why I like writing. I think writing allows me to understand myself better in the way I think better. So I'll start with a sketch of something, I'll start with a draft structure of what I want to do, but then I also give myself license to follow the natural path that essay is taking or that book is taking. And sometimes that's meant doing away with a book because it's not working, it's not taking me where I thought it would. Sometimes it's meant breaking a book into two and working on two separate things because they were two competing.
Can I ask you about that? Because I think that's such an important recognition that it's not killing the book usually when that happens. It's having got to know the book well enough that it's now told you I'm two books or I have a different angle, and being able to hear that.
Yes, it happens. It happens with paragraphs. It happens with books. You start writing something and you think you've got the scope of it, but then you start digging, especially with research, you always start thinking, oh, no one could possibly have thought about this before. And then, of course, you dig out 25 different articles and books on that topic. And then you start thinking differently, right? You start thinking, okay, actually, well, maybe this angle is more interesting. And then before you know it, it's sort of grown into distinct project.
Is it okay to ask for an example? Is there a book where that's happened?
My doctoral thesis was an example. I think by the end of the first year, I was writing two competing theses, one on cinema and one on film. And they weren't, initially I thought they were in dialogue with each other, but they weren't really. You know, the cinematic one was much more about the impact of the image, and the fiction one was a lot more about the content of those texts. So I decided to break them, and then one of them eventually became Horror, Film and Affect, the book I then went on to write. And the first one transmuted a little bit into what would become Body Gothic. I think initially I was trying to mash the two of them because in my mind I was trying to write about the body and affect together. And then although the body and affect is present in both of them, the focus was very, very different. What I was trying to do with one book was really look at the way that the body was represented as a way of sort of like then talking about affect. The other one was very much about how does horror, cinema specifically as a medium, convey that kind of emotion, and how does it do it through the body. So they were related, but they were different projects. And I kind of worked that out at the end of the first year of my PhD, which is when we normally call that the dark night of the soul. And I think every PhD student has it. I don't know if you agree.
Oh, yeah.
But there's a moment where you go, oh my God, what the hell am I doing? It's all wrong.
Absolutely full agreement on that. And I love that as an example. And it's so very, very, it's not even similar. It's identical to creative writing in that if we learn to listen, the book tells us you have got too much stuff crammed in here. I liken it to free-range chickens. You don't show that you love animals by keeping them all cramped in this space that is not enough for them. Whereas if you cut a section of the book, put this in this Word document, put that in that Word document, you are giving those chickens space to run around and breathe. They are going to have fuller, happier lives. Everybody's going to benefit. But it's still so hard to say that to yourself sometimes. It's still so instinctive to try and pack everything that this book could possibly be into one space and to think that that's somehow a good idea. And it really isn't.
I think when you start as well, like you have, I mean, I always thought maybe I'll only ever write one academic book because I didn't necessarily know that I was going to end up getting an academic job. I mean, as I say, I think it's easy to sort of ignore how precarious, especially the beginnings of academic life are. So I kept asking myself, if you only really ever get to publish one book, if you're lucky enough to get one book published, what do you want it to be? You know, which of these projects do you want it to be? I never really thought that I would be able to make them all happen. That's also the reason why nothing will ever top the feeling of getting that first book in your hand of, oh my God, it happened, I made it happen. Whatever happens after this, you know, that was like one of the things I really wanted to do in my life. I wanted to write one book that I knew would be stored in the British Library when all of the other copies get popped, you know, because no one's buying them. There will be one copy of the book. And it meant a lot to me to have my parents' names in that book, which is why I dedicated it to them. I'm the first person in my family to go to university, the first person in my family to just have a job that doesn't require physical labor, just as well, because I'm physically very unfit. So it meant a lot to me that I could just return the favor of the education that my parents gave me with a lot of hard labor on their part by having their names forever kept in the vaults of the British Library. So nothing will ever top that experience, I don't think. To go back to what we were talking about. So yeah, when this first happened to me, I just thought, how do I condense everything I want to say into this one book that might just be the book? You're right. I think it's about giving ideas the space to breathe. Books, characters, structures, narratives. I think it's just like sometimes something tells you it doesn't gel, or it's too big, or it's too confusing. There's too many strands. And I think it's a hard thing to do, but sometimes you just have to cut. And I think if what you've worked on is good enough, it will find its way back to you somehow.
That is such a beautiful thought.
The last thing I'll say is academic writing, like any other writing, is a very lonely process. So I'm still very surprised whenever I go to conferences or whenever I do a podcast with yourself to find out that actually people do read academic books, because a lot of it is just you writing in the void and kind of like sending it out to the world. And I think creative writers at least get the chance sometimes of doing book launches, meeting some of their readers. For academic writers, it's like you might encounter one person who's read part of your book and enjoyed it. So getting to do this podcast is a great privilege, and I really, really appreciate creative writers taking the time to speak to academic ones. As you say, I think there's a lot more connecting when we do than people realize. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And right back at you. There is so much that connects all kinds of writing, and the thing that I hope you're taking from this, that I'm certainly taking from this, is a beautiful reminder we are entitled to listen to and transcribe and explore all of our stories. There is no categorization. There are no fences that stop you being all of the versions of yourself. It's just curiosity in the end. Xavier Aldana Reyes, thank you so much for joining the Writers' Gym.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've visited the Writers' Gym with author and coach Dr Rachel Knightley. Production and sound design are by Ashley Lexine, and theme music is by Chris Gregory. To join a Writers' Gym workout online or in London, as a guest or as a member, visit writersgym.com or email thewritersgym@rachelknightley.com.